The war in the East had ended, but the echoes of its madness reverberated across the vast lands of the former Soviet Union and the shattered territories of Eastern Europe. Cities once alive with commerce, culture, and daily life now lay in ruins, their streets filled with rubble, the skeletal remains of buildings, and the detritus of destruction. The rivers carried debris and the soil still bore the scars of endless artillery bombardments. For every victory celebrated by the Soviets, for every territory reclaimed, a human tragedy had unfolded, millions of civilians dead, homes obliterated, and countless families torn apart. Entire communities vanished under the crushing weight of total war. In the aftermath, the scale of suffering became apparent. In the Western Soviet regions, villages had been burned systematically during the German retreat, part of a scorched earth policy intended to deny the Red Army any resources. Fields were left fallow, livestock killed, and wells poisoned. Roads and railways were destroyed to slow the advance of the Soviets, leaving towns isolated and starving. Survivors scavenged for food, often resorting to eating bark, roots, and anything that could sustain life. Disease spread rapidly, claiming tens of thousands, as medical infrastructure had been obliterated during the fighting. Hospitals had been bombed or burned, doctors and nurses were killed or missing, and medicines were scarce. The human cost was staggering. Far beyond the battlefield casualties alone, cities bore particular witness to the cruelty of the war. Stalingrad, Kursk, Kharkov, and Leningrad, among others, had been reduced to rubble. Leningrad, which had endured a brutal siege, witnessed nearly 1 million deaths from starvation, disease, and bombardment alone. In the West, Warsaw and other Polish cities suffered under occupation and destruction, often targeted both by German military campaigns and Soviet operations. The landscape of Eastern Europe had become a testament to human endurance, but also to human loss. Whole generations were marked by trauma and displacement, and survivors struggled to rebuild in a world without the structures they had once relied upon. The German retreat had left behind a trail of devastation that extended far beyond the physical. Millions of prisoners of war and forced labors returned home to find homes destroyed, families gone, and communities uprooted. The scale of displacement was immense. Refugees flowed across borders, fleeing from advancing armies or returning to find their lands unrecognizable. Eastern Europe, once a mosaic of towns, farms, and villages, was now a landscape dominated by ruins, military cemeteries, and the scars of trenches, bunkers, and craters. The occupation itself had been brutal. German authorities implemented policies that caused widespread suffering. Civilians were often executed in reprisal for partisan attacks, entire villages destroyed as punishment, and food requisitioned to support the Wehrmacht. In Belarus, Ukraine, and the Baltic states, partisan resistance grew steadily, sabotaging railways, ambushing convoys, and striking German supply lines. In response, German forces enacted harsh countermeasures, leading to massacres of civilians and systematic terror campaigns. Entire communities were wiped out, leaving only ruins and memorials in their place. The psychological impact of this terror endured long after the fighting ceased, shaping post-war societies and fueling cycles of revenge and memory. Soviet military operations, while victorious, came at enormous cost as well. Urban combat, such as that in Stalingrad and the later battles of 1943–44, destroyed infrastructure and killed civilians indiscriminately. Liberated towns were often occupied temporarily by Red Army units, and disorder in the immediate aftermath contributed to theft, violence, and additional suffering. The war scale left cities uninhabitable for months or years, with water systems, electricity, and sanitation completely destroyed. Rebuilding required immense effort, material, and labor, much of which was delayed due to ongoing reconstruction in the interior of the Soviet Union. The industrial regions of Ukraine, Belarus, and Western Russia had been particularly devastated. Factories were destroyed or dismantled, coal mines flooded or abandoned, and rail networks obliterated. The Soviet Union faced the monumental task of relocating and rebuilding industry. Much of it moved east of the Urals during the war, but the process of reconstruction was slow and fraught with logistical challenges. Towns and cities needed not just factories but schools, hospitals, housing, and basic infrastructure. Millions of displaced persons and returning soldiers required accommodation and employment, creating social pressures that would shape Soviet policy for decades. Beyond infrastructure, the human toll in psychological terms was profound. Soldiers returned from the front with trauma and injuries, both physical and emotional. Civilians who had survived bombings, sieges, and forced labor carried memories of extreme violence. Families had lost multiple members, and the cultural fabric of towns and cities had been disrupted. Orphans, widows, and disabled veterans became a permanent part of the post-war social landscape. The enormity of grief was difficult to quantify, yet it would influence literature, art, and collective memory across Eastern Europe for generations. The political consequences were equally far-reaching. The Red Army's victory in the East allowed the Soviet Union to exert control over Eastern Europe, shaping the political map for decades. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and the Baltic states fell under Soviet influence or direct control. The occupation established communist governments loyal to Moscow, setting the stage for the Cold War. Millions of people came under regimes enforced by the Soviet state, with political purges, arrests, and surveillance shaping everyday life. The immediate post-war years were marked by a combination of rebuilding and political repression, often inseparable from one another. The war crimes committed during Barbarossa also became central to the post-war narrative. The Holocaust reached its most deadly phase in the East, with extermination campaigns targeting Jews, Roma, and others. Einsatzgruppen and other SS units executed tens of thousands in mass shootings, often in towns and villages where ordinary citizens were forced to witness or participate. Labor camps, ghettos, and deportations compounded the human cost. The sheer scale of these crimes left deep social and cultural scars, creating both a historical record and a moral imperative for justice in the years to follow. In addition to deliberate acts of violence, famine and starvation followed the retreating armies. The scorched earth tactics of the Germans, combined with the destruction of agricultural lands, disrupted harvests across Ukraine, Belarus, and Western Russia. Millions faced hunger and malnutrition in the months after liberation. Relief efforts were organized by Soviet authorities, often slowly, and relied on both local resources and international aid. The rebuilding of agriculture was a slow process, hindered by ongoing partisan activity, mines, and destroyed transportation networks. The ecological and environmental cost of Barbarossa was also immense. Forests were burned, rivers polluted, and farmland destroyed. Military operations scarred the soil with craters, trenches, and chemical residues from explosives. Cities destroyed by bombing and artillery left ash and rubble covering streets and fields. Wildlife populations were disrupted, with hunting, starvation, and habitat destruction taking a toll. Even decades later, some areas bore the legacy of war in contaminated soil, unexploded ordnance, and destroyed forests, reminding future generations of the conflict's far-reaching impact. Cultural heritage was similarly devastated. Churches, museums, libraries, and archives were destroyed or looted. Manuscripts, books, and works of art were lost forever. Cities such as Kiev, Minsk, and Smolensk lost centuries of architecture, historical landmarks, and irreplaceable cultural treasures. The effort to reconstruct cultural identity became intertwined with the political landscape, as the Soviet state promoted narratives emphasizing heroism, endurance, and ideological loyalty while often suppressing dissenting perspectives. In the aftermath of Barbarossa, memory itself became a battleground. Monuments, museums, and memorials were erected to honor the dead and celebrate victory, but they also served political purposes, shaping national identity and the interpretation of history. Survivors' stories were collected, but often filtered through the lens of ideology. Literature, film, and music portrayed both heroism and suffering, creating a collective memory that emphasized endurance and triumph over adversity. Even while the scale of loss remained almost incomprehensible, the legacy of Barbarossa also shaped military and strategic thinking for decades. The lessons of logistics, the dangers of overextension, the challenges of terrain, and the consequences of underestimating an opponent became central to military academies across the world. Generals studied the campaign as both a model of operational ambition and a cautionary tale. The vastness of the Eastern Front, the brutal winter, and the industrial and human capacity of the Soviet Union demonstrated the limits of even the most disciplined armies when faced with total war. By the late 1940s, Reconstruction had begun to reshape the Eastern European landscape. Cities were rebuilt, industrial capacity restored, and transportation networks reconstructed. Yet the social fabric remained altered. Millions had died, millions more had migrated or been displaced, and the psychological scars of trauma endured. The experience of Barbarossa, the devastation it caused, and the endurance it demanded became defining elements of Soviet identity, Eastern European history, and the global memory of the Second World War. Even as Reconstruction progressed, the political landscape of Eastern Europe had been permanently altered. The Soviet Union consolidated power across the territories it had liberated, establishing communist regimes, often staffed by local collaborators and Soviet officials. Elections were tightly controlled or staged to ensure loyalty, dissent was suppressed, and security services monitored everyday life. The political transformation was rapid, leaving little room for alternative governance or opposition. For millions of citizens, this shift marked a second occupation, one that, while different from the German invader, imposed strict control, ideological conformity, and state surveillance. War crime tribunals and post-war justice began to unfold. High-ranking German officers, Nazi officials, and collaborators were tried for atrocities committed during the invasion. The Nuremberg trials became the most visible stage of this reckoning, establishing the principle of accountability for crimes against humanity. On the ground in Eastern Europe, Soviet military tribunals addressed crimes committed by both occupiers and collaborators. However, justice was uneven, often used as a tool of political consolidation rather than impartial reckoning. Many survivors never saw the perpetrators punished, and some escaped entirely, blending into post-war chaos. The human cost of Barbarossa remained evident in daily life. Millions of widows, orphans, and disabled veterans required support. Cities struggled with housing shortages, destroyed infrastructure, and collapsed economies. Rationing, scarcity, and the lingering effects of famine were common in the immediate post-war years. Reconstruction was slow and arduous, dependent on the mobilization of both labor and resources, often under difficult conditions and harsh climate. Women, in particular, played a critical role in rebuilding homes, factories, and communities, taking on tasks previously reserved for men who had perished in the conflict. The psychological scars of the war were profound and enduring. Veterans returned with trauma, witnessing death on an industrial scale, while civilians bore memories of sieges, bombings, and occupation. Children who had survived were often left orphaned or displaced, their formative years shaped by violence and loss. Survivors struggled to reconcile the scale of death with the need to rebuild. Societies learned to endure, adapt, and memorialize their experiences, but the shadow of war persisted for decades. Literature, art, and film often reflected these themes, portraying heroism and suffering while reinforcing collective memory shaped by political and cultural narratives. The environmental consequences of Barbarossa were also staggering. Forests had been cut down for firewood or destroyed in combat, rivers polluted with industrial and chemical waste, and farmland scarred by explosives and military activity. Wildlife populations had been decimated, and ecological recovery was slow. Mines, unexploded ordnance, and destroyed infrastructure created long-term hazards. Even decades later, remnants of the war persisted in the landscape, fields contaminated, rivers still choked with debris, and forests interrupted by scars of trenches and fortifications. Education and culture had to be rebuilt almost from scratch. Schools, universities, and libraries were destroyed or looted, while teachers and intellectuals had been killed, exiled, or conscripted. In the post-war years, the Soviet system sought to re-establish education under strict ideological guidance. Curricula emphasized heroism, resilience, and the narrative of victory, often downplaying the horrors of the war when they contradicted political objectives. Cultural life slowly revived, with theater, literature, and music reflecting both the trauma and the triumph of survival. Monuments and memorials proliferated, shaping national identity and preserving the memory of loss and endurance. The scale of population displacement was unprecedented. Millions returned to find homes destroyed or occupied by others, leading to migration, resettlement, and conflict over resources. Refugees crossed borders, seeking safety or reunification with surviving family members. Entire communities had vanished, and ethnic cleansing and forced migration reshaped the demographic map of Eastern Europe. These movements created lasting social and political consequences, influencing borders, ethnic composition, and intergroup relations for decades to come. Economically, Eastern Europe faced immense challenges. Agriculture had been disrupted, industry destroyed, and trade routes severed. Soviet planning emphasized reconstruction through central control, nationalization of industry, and collective farming initiatives. Cities and factories east of the Urals, spared the worst of the fighting, became hubs of production supporting rebuilding efforts. Yet shortages of food, housing, and raw materials persisted. Recovery required decades of labor and planning, often at the expense of personal freedom and under strict political oversight. The memory of war atrocities shaped post-war society profoundly. The Holocaust, mass executions, and reprisals against civilians were memorialized, though narratives were often filtered through ideological frameworks. Survivors' accounts, archives, and physical evidence provided irrefutable testimony to the scale of human suffering. Monuments, museums, and commemorations reinforced these memories, emphasizing both tragedy and heroism. These efforts created a collective understanding of the past, shaping national identities, foreign policy, and social consciousness internationally. The aftermath of Barbarossa reshaped the balance of power. The Soviet Union emerged as a superpower, controlling Eastern Europe and asserting influence in global politics. Its military and industrial strength, proven during the Eastern Front campaigns, gave it leverage in negotiations, occupation, and post-war reconstruction. The devastation experienced by Germany, Poland, and other nations provided both a warning and an opportunity for the Soviet Union to project power, establish buffer zones, and secure ideological allies across the region. The psychological impact on German society was equally profound. Millions of returning soldiers, refugees, and civilians confronted the reality of total defeat. Cities in ruins, industries destroyed, and millions of casualties created a sense of humiliation and loss. Families mourned the dead while attempting to rebuild shattered lives. The occupation of Germany by Allied forces, divided between East and West, ensured that the legacy of defeat would influence politics, society, and memory for decades. Denazification, trials, and the reorganization of political life attempted to reconcile past atrocities with rebuilding, but the trauma of Barbarossa lingered as a constant reminder of the consequences of ambition and hubris. The experience of Barbarossa also influenced military thinking for generations. Commanders, historians, and strategists studied the campaign to understand logistics, operational planning, and the interplay between ideology and strategy. Lessons about overextension, supply challenges, the impact of terrain and climate, and the importance of morale became central to military education worldwide. The Eastern Front became a case study in the limits of aggression, the costs of underestimating an opponent, and the consequences of waging war on an ideological basis rather than purely strategic considerations. Socially, the war left deep scars. Families were permanently altered by the loss of men, women, and children. Communities that had existed for centuries vanished entirely or were replaced by new settlements. Survivors carried memories of extreme violence, loss, and endurance that influenced post-war behavior, social structures, and political allegiance. The need to rebuild created opportunities for resilience, adaptation, and social cohesion, but it also entrenched trauma, mistrust, and the memory of violence. In the decades following the war, Eastern Europe saw both reconstruction and repression. The Soviet Union rebuilt cities, infrastructure, and industry, but also imposed political conformity, surveillance, and ideological control. Monuments commemorated victory and heroism, while textbooks emphasized sacrifice and endurance. At the same time, private grief, local memories, and personal trauma remained deeply felt, even as public narratives sought to unify and inspire. The memory of Barbarossa was thus both collective and personal, public and private, shaping identity on multiple levels. The cost of Barbarossa was measured not only in lives lost but in lost culture, destroyed infrastructure, and disrupted societies. Art, literature, architecture, and daily life had been obliterated in countless communities. Recovery required decades, yet the memory of destruction remained a defining element of post-war Eastern Europe. Survivors passed down stories of endurance, loss, and survival, creating a historical consciousness that informed identity, politics, and culture. Even in the 21st century, the Eastern Front remains a subject of study and reflection. The scale of destruction, the human suffering, and the strategic consequences continue to resonate. Cities rebuilt, yet scars remain visible in landscapes, memorials, and cultural memory. Nations reshaped by the conflict continue to grapple with a legacy of occupation, collaboration, resistance, and endurance. The aftermath of Barbarossa thus serves as a cautionary tale, a reminder of both the depths of human cruelty and the capacity for resilience, the cost of madness, the ambition that drove Germany eastward, the ideological zeal that justified mass murder, and the unyielding resistance of the Soviet Union, left a permanent imprint on history. Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union had survived, but at a cost measured in millions of lives, destroyed cities, and fractured societies. The lessons endured: unchecked ambition, the underestimation of an opponent, and the human consequences of total war could destroy nations and alter the course of history. Barbarossa's aftermath was not merely a historical event but a foundational moment that defined post-war Eastern Europe. It shaped political boundaries, demographic patterns, cultural memory, and the collective consciousness of nations. The ruins of cities, the graves of soldiers, the displaced populations, and the memorials constructed in the decades after the war testified to the scale of human suffering and the resilience required to endure. In the end, the cost of madness was both tangible and intangible. The physical destruction, the human loss, the political transformations, and the psychological scars formed a complex legacy that continues to influence generations. Operation Barbarossa had not only failed in its strategic objectives but had reshaped the world in ways that would echo long after the guns fell silent. Its aftermath remains a testament to the limits of ambition, the endurance of human societies, and the enduring power of memory.